Hello, fellow travelers. This is Grotnip, welcoming you all back to the logbook of a simple Lindworm traveler. Today we are going to be starting a whole new series called the Sagas of the Heroes, and it's going to be hopefully a long and successful series of battle reports to come. So let's get cracking. Before we get to the actual contents of the battle report itself, a few words of forewarning. What follows next is going to be my first attempt at a Warcrow Battle Report, a long time dream of mine to get done, as there aren't too many Warcrow Battle Reports out there at the moment. As this is going to be my first attempt at this, please feel free to comment and suggest. Give roses where I get something right and let me know what you would like to see changed going forward. Do, however, keep in mind that my resources, both time, skills, and the programs that I have available are rather limited, however. In this battle report, I'm seeking to find a good balance between easy accessibility for newer players, decent enough visuals to keep people engaged, enough details so that even those who are more familiar with the game can get their money's worth out of this, and good enough tempo so that this battle report doesn't drag too much. So there are quite a few things to balance here, so feel free to chime in and let me know how well or how badly I do by the end of this whole thing. As this is going to be my first battle report, I was thinking that I'm going to generally go a bit slower and explain things a bit more, so that if this is the first battle report that people interested in Warcrow take a look at, I wouldn't be speaking so many things in gibberish that they don't understand, but rather I would walk them through many of the things. At the same time, knowing myself, I'm about to get excited at some points and I might get carried away and rush over some things, but thanks to the wonders of editing, maybe if I have the time, I will then return and redo the parts where I went too quickly and didn't explain myself properly. Those of you who are familiar with my previous work in my The Good Guys Were Orange Rama Task Force Infinity blog from N4 know that when I do battle reports, it's very important for me that it's not a me and me show, but that the gaming buddy that I'm working with at any given time also gets their voice heard in the end product. At the end of the day, I'm going to be the one narrating this stuff. I'm the one who has prepared this battle report, and I'm going to be the one unreliable narrator that you all have to live with. But then again, we are trying to write objective history for future generations to study. We are looking to do something here that people can find some enjoyment from and maybe even learn something from. So the comments about what my opponent for today was thinking or saying during the game or after come from our discussions during the gameplay. We had a somewhat lengthy of a discussion analysis afterwards, and I also asked my opponent to comment on the script for this battle report so that I can get more of his thoughts in. My opponent today is going to be my longtime friend Tanan. I was calculating that Warcrow is, I think, the third miniature game that we are playing competitively together. We used to attend War Machine tournaments back in the heyday of that game quite a lot together. We have been grinding Infinity for years now, and now Warcrow is our next thing that we are trying together. While Tanan hasn't played all that many games of Warcrow, he's a veteran of decades of gaming experience, and his mind is really extremely strategically inclined, and he's really capable of finding things and tricks and tactics that no one else who I know would be able to figure out. So I'm really excited and at the same time slightly nervous going into this game against him. So I trust that he's going to be giving me full on challenge today. The problem with me and Tanan playing is that unfortunately we do not live in the same city. There's actually quite a substantial distance between us, and he does not have a collection of Warcrow models of his own as of right now, even though he's planning on getting some sooner or later. So we had to find a way to organize this game in a way where I can prepare all the models for both of us, painting some if that was necessary, and at the same time not the situation be so that I will enforce a scenario and a feat upon him and then design the lists, because I feel that even if I try to be objective, my biases would probably end up meaning that the situation would not actually be fair for Tanan. So that's why we went through this rather elaborate process of setting up this game. What we ended up doing was that I randomized a set of 3 scenarios and 3 feats for us to choose our scenario and feat from. In the next step, I vetoed one of the scenarios, presenting the rest of the options to Tanan, who then vetoed another scenario and a single feat out of the list. And then in the end, I vetoed one of the 2 remaining feats, and that gave us the combination of the loot scenario and the resources feat for today's game. As I had to pack and bring the models for my opponent to use, and I also had to actually paint a substantial number of them during the last week before the game, we ended up doing the lists in a way that I first made mine and sent it to Tanan, and then he made his. I'm pretty sure he didn't look or analyze my list beforehand, but I wanted to send it to him so that there is a transparency in that I'm not going to be designing a list to beat his in any regard. Then Tanan made his list and sent it back to me so that I can paint and pack everything necessary. This meant that we knew exactly what each of us was bringing beforehand, which is not usually the case when playing with the Warcrow tournament rules, since the rules stipulate that you keep the presence of all the troops as hidden information until the time comes to place them on the table. So we had more knowledge from the get-go than you would usually have, so keep that in mind. When it comes to the table, we were playing at Tanan's house, and he graciously volunteered to set up the table and use his own terrain. So that's what we were doing, terrain and board-wise, as you are about to see. A quick overview of the adventure that we are about to play today. You can find this in the Warcrow tournament rules, and feel free to skip this part if you are already intimately familiar with the scenario and the feat in question. Today's scenario was called Loot, and in Loot you place 5 loot markers, objective markers on the table, as you see in the map on the left there. Unlike in a normal game of Warcrow, where you are attempting to capture the objectives by having more troops or more conquest value worth of troops next to each one, in this one you are actually not trying to occupy the area next to the objective markers, but rather the objective markers are supposed to represent loot of worth, some worth that's been left on the field of battle, and each player is trying to get their share and drag it away before the other one can access it. The loot effectively work in a way that a unit that is adjacent to one, that is in base-to-base contact with one, can pick one up by suffering a point of stress, and then they will hold on to that loot until the unit is destroyed or it flees the field of battle, either in which case the loot is dropped to the ground. What the colors signify is the fact that a player can only ever pick up their own loot or the neutral loot in the middle of the battlefield. So there are two loot markers that only you can interact with. There are two that your opponent can interact with, and then there's a third that either one can access throughout the battle. And this means that the middle loot marker should in most instances see most action, so to speak, and both of us would end up building lists that were capable of securing that central neutral loot marker early on. When it comes to the scoring of this mission at the end of each round, so 3 times during the length of the game, each company would receive a military point if they controlled at least a single piece of loot, another military point if they controlled more loot than their rival total, and in this the middle loot token would be extremely instrumental, and lastly a single military point if the opponent controlled no loot. From the get-go, this is looking to be a rather low military point scoring mission, since securing at least one loot for each side should be rather trivial, and then it would be probably more or less a case of tug of war about the neutral loot, unless one side was able to decisively beat those units that were going to be holding the friendly loot markers of each side. But obviously both players coming into this game knowing the importance of holding onto those loot would select very resilient units or fast moving units that could access those loot tokens and then keep them safe going forward. For those of you new to the game's tournament rules, each Warcrow tournament adventure EA mission is made up of 2 components: the scenario that forms the basics and the feat that adds another scoring method for the game. And today's extra scoring method, that is feat, was called resources. In resources, units that are positioned more than 12 strides away from the deployment zone at the end of their activation and are not engaged in melee at the time can stress themselves to try and obtain valuable resources left behind on the field of battle, or maybe, I don't know, there's a natural occurring valuable minerals or magical fruit or whatever that the forces are trying to gather. Upon taking a point of stress for the troubles, units that comply with the conditions of being able to extract resources are going to be allowed to roll a number of dice depending on the amount of models in the unit, with a single troop units rolling only a yellow dice, 2 to 3 troop units rolling a yellow and a orange one, and the holy grail of this mission, the whole straight flush of offensive dice, a yellow, orange and a red one, comes to those units of 4 or more troops looking to obtain resources. Each success obtained on this dice will then advance a scoring meter for each of the sides, and each side would be cashing in arcane points at the end of the game in accordance to how much resources they had gathered. The trick is that if either player ever got to full 10 points on resources, they would stop advancing their own resource meter, and rather they would start pushing their opponent's resource meter down, and in this way they would be able to keep advancing the feat side of the scenario. As you can see from there, at the end of the game, each player would score a single arcane point if they had at least 4 points on the resource meter, an additional one if they reach 7, and a third one if they got all the way to 10. And also a single point if they have more resources under their control than their opponent. And in a loot scenario where I was thinking that, okay, there's not going to be a big difference between military points, probably, unless something goes terribly wrong for either side. The resource side of this mission would probably end up being the one that would eventually be more impactful when it came to deciding the victor. So I, for one, went into this game thinking that I need to be able to secure the loot, yes, but gathering as many resources as possible would be at least as important, if not downright more important, for who would go on and win the game. For newer players, in tournament scenarios, you do at the end of the game combine the arcane points and the military points from both sides into victory point totals, and whoever has more victory points total wins the game. But if the victor does not secure both more victory points and also more military and arcane points than their opponent, they don't actually get the full tournament points that are possible for a victory, and at the same time the defeated player gets to walk away from the contest with a tournament point under their belt, so that they can help, so that point can help them place higher in the end result of the tournament. So this is a really cool mechanic that I talked about in my video about the tournament rules more. Here's a visual representation of the Northern Tribes Company. That is an army list that I chose to build for this adventure. For newer players, when you play a full-sized game of Warcrow, you are supposed to build a list of 250 points or less, and my list here is exactly that. The only other real restriction is that you have to have at least a single officer type character to act as your company's leader, and this can be important in some feats. For example, there's a feat where you're supposed to try and wipe out your opponent's leader, so that's where that may, for example, come into play. And if you choose to include a high command character, you can only ever have one, and they automatically become your company's leader. Many characters and some of the units, in addition to all the other combat capabilities and special skills, abilities and rules that they bring to the battlefield, also provide your force with command points. And these command points are not only used to trigger powerful command skills during the game, but they are also used to determine which side is advantaged strategically when coming into the game, e.a. when you roll your dice for who gets to pick the turn order or the table side to deploy on. And hence I have marked the total amount of command points there at the top, and my list has 5 CPs to work with. The core of my list is 2 units of orc hunters led by 2 capable orc officers. The hunters are the basic melee infantry unit of the Northern Tribes faction, and I like them for their combination of excellent attack value and decent enough defensive metrics when they are strengthened by a character joining them. Their cheap points cost means that they are easy to include in your forces, and they are naturally capable of inflicting the damage increasing vulnerable state upon their enemies. The characters that I chose to lead my Orc Hunters into battle are my High Command, the Orc Wrathmane, who makes the Orc Hunters more deadly in melee, more sturdy on the defense, and also he gives them some more scenario play potential with his displays effect switch. The Wrathmane also provides my force with two very important command tokens, as getting command tokens for the Northern Tribes faction can be a bit of a difficult ordeal, so I like to include him for that also. My second squad is going to be led by Lotta, who's a very capable unit leader who, in addition to increasing the offensive and defensive power of the unit and strengthening their willpower and morale, also increases their threat range via her command skill Move Your Asses. When building a list for a Warcrow adventure or a pickup game, you don't actually need to decide beforehand what characters are going to be joining what units, but I think that most of us players do tend to have a combination or potential combinations in mind when we do pick units and pick characters for our forces. And then maybe the battlefield situation forces you to do something else, but generally speaking, when I pick my hunters and pick the characters that I want to lead them, that's actually the way I'm going to deploy them on the battlefield. On this visual representation of the army list, I have chosen to combine or like push together the unit and the character that will be fighting together in this battle report for easy visualizer on what's going to be taking to the field soon enough. When it comes to my staunch armored fist of a unit that can either lead the attack or take point on defense, I'm going to be using my veteran orc warriors, the battle scarred, who are joined by even more veteran a presence in the orc Wisemane. This is a combination that I have really become quite reliant on. The battle scarred in and off of themselves are extremely durable, and they are capable of dishing out some excellent damage, and they are quite brave for orc infantry from the get-go. And when one adds the Wisemane support character to the unit, they become fearless, which means that they are effectively immune to many of the psychological tricks that the Scions of Yaldabaoth might use against such an elite unit in lieu of engaging them traditionally, so I wanted to be safe from such events. The Wisemane also increases their already formidable offense and defense to a whole nother level, and the fact that he grants the unit rerolls on their willpower rolls makes them next to unbreakable on the field of battle, so that's why I'm fielding this combination that surprisingly doesn't actually cost all that much more than, for example, the Wrathmane's Hunter unit. Beyond these three mainstay infantry units, my list is composed of a collection of support characters who are supposed to help me get the most out of my orc infantry. First on this list is the Evoker, the orc shaman of sorts, and her job is to keep my orc infantry in the fight by lending her command skill Delegate of the Ancestors to strengthen the resolve of the orcs should any of them flee from the enemy. She's also capable of casting the spell Spirit of Thermopleurus that can, in its best forms, automatically break enemy units that attempt to engage the orcish forces. But the Scions of Yaldabaoth are home to several units of golem type infantry, or units rather, and also other types of units that are either fearless or otherwise unmoved by the horrors of the battlefield. So I'm not going into this battle thinking that the Spirit of Thermopleurus spell is going to be a big money maker. The Evoker also has a magic missile spell of swords in the Summon the Rock, but likewise the spell isn't all that formidable in its damage component, so I'm not planning on using that all too much. My next supporting character is a fighter type character called the Prime Warrior. She's a dangerous combatant all by herself, but I'm more looking to leverage her as an enabler for my other troops. Her passive skill, Orc Warrior's Honor, means that if she manages to inflict any damage in melee, all the other Orc units around her are going to be able to reduce their stress levels, and if she attacks or becomes attacked by the enemy, she can activate her Experience and Rage command skill in order to effectively grant another Orc unit an extra activation, which can be quite powerful in the right circumstances. The loot scenario is made up of only 3 rounds of 5 turns each, which means that if I can get an extra activation or even 2 out of my Prime Warrior, that should be quite impactful all in all. The only Varang of my force is a tattooist, and she's a very traditional support type character. She's going to be my healer, and she's also capable of ridding my troops of any negative states that my opponent tries to leverage against me. And this can be especially helpful against the Scions of Yaldabaoth, since their units do have some combinations where they first inflict a state such as, for example, frightened upon their enemies and then seek to break them with another ability or stress inducing abilities or something like this. The tattooist is also a minor threat as a ranged combatant, so I'm hoping that she can help keep my opponent's more fragile pieces honest, so that they can go about by themselves near the front line. Usually I would like to access the tattooist's scout ability, which allows her to outflank the enemy and join the battlefield later on, maybe grab an undefended objective. But firstly, in this scenario, there is actually no benefit per se in infiltrating her to the enemy backline, since there are not going to be any objectives there that she can actually interact with. And additionally, she has the passive skill Hallucinogenic Mushrooms, which makes the Evoker spellcasting pretty trivial a thing, but she needs to be present on the battlefield for this ability to kick in. So I'm going to be deploying my tattooist on my deployment zone as usual, or as normal troops do, and maybe I can use her to hold a loot counter later on if that becomes necessary. The last piece of my force is the Dark Master, and this is a character that I'm really struggling to build lists without these days. The Dark Master is a capable ambusher who can spring a trap on the enemy by materializing effectively out of nowhere and immediately engaging them in melee. Despite being a assassin type character, the Dark Master is also surprisingly sturdy and difficult to get rid of, and extremely importantly, he provides my entire force with the permanent passive skill Sharp Perception, which means that if my opponent seeks to leverage any ambushers or scouts against me, nearby Northern Tribes units will actually be forewarned by the Dark Master of the presence of such foes, and they will be able to reposition themselves into more advantageous spots or even into total safety when ambushers or scouts come calling. The Scions of Yaldabaoth have an excellent selection of ambushers that they have access to, and even a scout unit or two, so I think that this ability is a good insurance to have to round out my force. Also, in the loot scenario specifically, the Dark Master is my piece for grabbing the middle neutral loot marker on the very first turn, should I be so lucky as to win the initiative roll and get the chance to do so. The Dark Master could potentially ambush into contact with the loot marker, pick it up, and then start yeeting it back towards the relative safety of my deployment zone, which would effectively trivialize the loot part of scoring the mission from very much the beginning of the game, and I would be free to concentrate on just accumulating arcane points through gathering resources, but let's see if I can manage that. Next up is the Scions of Yaldabaoth company created by Tanan. I have used the same visualization method here, and I have placed the units and characters top bars of their cards touching one another if they were forming a combined unit during the game. Tanan said that he was looking to build a list that would be as mobile and resilient as possible to take on the challenges offered by the scenario, and I really feel that he really managed to do that, and trying to pin down and grind down this force would prove to be quite a task. The basis of this list is formed by a couple of strong units of red caps. These demon-like creatures are extremely mobile, surprisingly offensively dangerous, and quite difficult to wipe out. And what makes them even more dangerous and even more resilient is the inclusion of the Vampirite spellcaster. This unit is capable of not only returning single models of red caps that have been destroyed back to their units mid-game, which is a rare capability in Warcrow, but he's also capable of returning entire units of gobblers or bugbowls back to the battlefield should they get wiped out. In addition to this, the Vampirite can enhance the fighting prowess of the other Red Caps units with their spellcasting, and they are also a decent enough threat in melee by themselves, so quite a formidable package from the get-go. A stable of Tanan's lists that he has been building so far has also been the Needle, a dark medic type unit character who's capable of returning destroyed models into units via their Stitch Up Bodies ability, which not only returns these models back into the fray, but also causes the frightened state upon enemies who have to witness such horrible and macabre sights, and the frightened state means that the enemy units are more likely to break under the stress of the battle. In this game, Tanan chose to attach the Needle to a unit of marked marksmen. This unit is a scout unit, which means that the Needle can join the battle later on wherever its dark arts are needed the most. The list is rounded out with the Echoes, a powerful elite melee unit made up of two elven ghosts who get to choose from two different memories of the ancient empire skills, and obviously Tanan goes for the aspect of the defender, which makes the Echoes 4 wounds a pop and gives them an additional point of conquest. Obviously the point of conquest is going to be moot in this mission, but in other missions that would be important. The last red caps of the force are two sightlesses, or I don't know if I said that right, but okay, let's just go with sightlesses. These support characters are capable of joining Redcap's units in order to enhance their fighting prowess, and they can also be run solo. And as solo models, they are capable of inflicting automatic damage upon enemy units that are adjacent to, that is, touching them at the end of the round, and they are also capable of healing Redcap's units by being adjacent to them at the end of the round. Tanan was also intrigued by their potential for inflicting tinge, a usually only magic wielder affecting dark substance that can prove to be dangerous for units and characters that accumulate large amounts of it during a game of Warcrow. The very final piece to be covered from this list is the Overseer, a red cap character who increases the offensive and defensive potential of any red cap unit that it joins, while also providing some potential additional mobility through its ability to throw around the smaller red caps. The Overseer also provides the list with 2 command tokens at a very reasonable price point, which is going to be quite important for Tanan, as he's going to be hoping to utilize the double recursion command skills that he has access to through the Rumpy Ride and the Needle, and that's going to need those command tokens to fuel returning fallen forces back to the field of battle. Speaking of the field of battle, this is going to be our table for today's game, and I'm going to be using variations of this picture to visualize what's going on the battlefield at any given time. We have 2 structures on the field, as you can see. The structures block line of sight and they are impassable terrain, so troops cannot access them, you have to go around. There's a single piece of dense forest, since neither of us was packing any units of cavalry or golems. Only keywords of importance for this game would be the ones block line of sight and cover blue. There was also a pond of shallow water, which we considered a piece of rugged terrain. Rugged terrain stops units that can't ignore the keyword from charging into or through it, and any unit that comes into contact with the said terrain piece would obtain the slowed state, impairing their future attempts to maneuver around the battlefield. There was also a patch of ruins towards the north of this map, and it would also be rugged terrain and also offering some blue cover against ranged attacks. The last terrain pieces to be placed were 4 pieces of wall, and these walls would be simply cover blue. And here we have the objectives, the loot counters that we will be fighting over today. 2 on close to the deployment zones to the south and to the north of the battlefield are for each side, and only they can interact with the said tokens. And then on the middle point of the table is the neutral loot token that's going to, I would suspect, in many games of the loot scenario, become quite an instrument of tug of war between the forces. Okay, and with that we are off to the races. When we start the battle, both sides gather their initiative roll to see who is advantaged going into the battle. As the Scions force was rocking 6 command points to the Northern Tribes' 5, they had the advantage at this point, which meant that the Scions player, Tanan, was rolling 2 orange and a yellow dice, looking for a maximum amount of successes to win the roll, and I had to contend with a single orange and a single yellow dice. And as is usually going to be the case when this dice roll happens, the player with more dice wins, and thus Tanan was able to pick between keeping the initiative, that is deciding who activates first on the first round of the game, or choosing the deployment zone where they would want to have their forces deploy. In the rulebook scenarios, or at least most of them, the scenario scoring favors whoever goes second. So usually players who get to keep initiative will choose in the rulebook missions to go indeed second, but in this mission both of us were very much looking forward to getting the first turn and trying to access the neutral middle loot token as soon as possible. So when Tanan won the roll, he immediately picked the initiative, which I already knew to be meaning that he would be going first, and this meant that my plan of using the Dark Master to capture the middle loot objective on the first turn would be null going forward. I got to choose the deployment side, so I chose to deploy on the south flank or the south side of the table. I was looking to use the dense terrain's block line of sight keyword to hide any fragile units, maintaining possession of the loot markers if that became necessary, and I didn't want to have to deal with the rugged ruins terrain in the north, so I chose Tanan to have that side for his own. Since Tanan was the one holding the initiative, I had to be the one to deploy the first unit onto the field. I chose my battle-scarred since I was very confident in them capturing the friendly to me loot token that was further away from my deployment zone and then pressing the attack forward. They would be the unit that would be the most difficult by far out of all of my troops to get wiped out or scared off the field of battle, and I was thinking that if Tanan was willing to use several units to engage them at once, that would give me a golden opportunity to countercharge and turn the battle in my favor. Tanan chose to respond by placing his gobblers dead center of his deployment zone, and it was pretty self-evident what was about to happen. The gobblers would be tasked with grabbing the middle loot token before I could respond, and I had to contend with this fact going forward. Next up, both of us would attach our first characters to our first units. I placed my Wise Main in the battle scarred as per the plan, and Tanan chose to attach the Overseer to the Gobblers. Next up, I placed my first unit of Orc Hunters with the intention of having them either A, capture my second loot token, or if that was not necessary, just yeet them forward towards the Scions lines, hopefully pressuring any of their units hoping to capture their friendly loot marker, or just plain charging in to inflict maximum damage. Tanan seemed to have more or less the same idea. He chose to have his echoes take up the responsibility of capturing and holding one of his loot tokens, and this elite melee unit would also serve as important backup for the gobblers should they find themselves in trouble while trying to extract the middle objective. I next tried to delay the proceedings and see what Tanan would be deploying where next by attaching my Wrath Main to the Hunters, but he was able to more or less counter this by placing his solo Sightless on the flank of the Echoes to support them. This meant that I was next up in line, and I chose to place my second unit of Orc Hunters pretty much on the center line, thinking that I would be able to use them on either flank depending on how the situation would turn out after the first few activations of the game. Tanan then used the buck bowls to hold my left flank, and I attached Lotta to the hunters as per plan. Tanan then used his second sightless by attaching it to the buck bowls for additional combat prowess, and now I only had a few of my characters left to deploy at this point. I chose to put the tattooist between my Orc Hunters so that she could remove any nasty states from them if that became ever a priority, and I was also thinking that she would be a good secondary candidate for taking my loot token if that ever became a necessity. Tanan then placed his Rumpy Ride behind the ruins as he was expecting Dark Master, or if this was theoretically a mission or a situation where we didn't know each other's list, any other northern tribes ambusher to come calling and trying to take out this very important character. So he figured that by hiding it behind a rugged terrain that stops charging, the Rumpy Ride should be more or less safe, at least for the early stages of the battle. This meant that I only had my two supporting characters left to deploy, and I chose to deploy them as non-committedly as possible near the center point of my line. I was hoping to, in this way, facilitate their movement towards either flank and hope that I would be able to cover as many of my units with their stress removing abilities and other support skills that I have brought them for. All this meant that both of us had a single unit held off the table. Mine was the ambushing Dark Master, and Tanan's was a unit of marked marksmen accompanied by the Needle. At the start of the first round, both the Gobblers and the Buckballs get to displace forward 8 strides thanks to their special passive skill Anxious Mob. The Gobblers would make good use of this movement to get them into a position from which they would be able to grab the neutral loot token on their first activation, and the Book Bowls started making their way around the ruins so as to not suffer from the slowed state moving forward. The Gobblers proceed on the first turn to fulfill their part of Tanan's battle plan by moving into the middle of the board and picking up the neutral loot token there. I have now changed the color on the edges of the unit's marker on the map there to showcase that they are now holding the loot token for ease of reference for everyone at home. At this point we have a discussion whether trying to gather resources with this activation would also be a good idea. The Gobblers already have to endure a point of stress to pick up the loot, and gathering resources would put them at their full morale value of 2, meaning that they would be unable to activate for the rest of the round unless they were able to perform the rest action and shed all their stress. Eventually we came to the conclusion that Tanan might as well just gather resources, because if and when I was able to engage the unit and push any damage through, they would be effectively at full morale of stress anyway, so they wouldn't be able to activate at all no matter what. And then again, the Gobblers cannot be broken. They have a special rule that means that they will never flee the field of battle, so there was no risk involved in the potential for them to receiving more stress than they have morale. So this is the logic behind the actions performed by my opponent on his first activation. At this point, I choose to commit my Dark Master very early. I'm afraid that if I don't engage the gobblers immediately, my opponent will be able to rest with them and escape with the neutral loot token, which would trivialize scoring the scenario from my opponent, and that would mean that he would have all the time in the world to focus on just fulfilling the conditions of the feat, which might make it difficult, a uphill battle for me. So I choose to charge the Dark Master out of ambush into the gobblers to inflict some damage on them, and more importantly stop them from retreating and resting. They can't retreat because they are full of stress, and they cannot rest because they are now engaged by an enemy unit. Annoyingly enough, the gobblers and the bugbowls for that matter have a special rule called tiny, which means that the Scions player can force their opponent's units to reroll any dice with successes on them when attacking the said tiny units. Then again, luckily enough, the Dark Master isn't reliant on standard success symbols in order to deal damage, but rather I was able to use the hollow successes to inflict automatic wounds and the double special switch to add a success to the roll. So my opponent was only able to enforce me to reroll my double success on the red dice, and I managed to reroll into yet another double success anyway. So I was able to wipe out a single gobbler for my trouble. My opponent admitted that he wasn't expecting the Dark Master to come calling all that soon, so he chooses to have the echoes advance forward in order to support the now embattled gobblers. The echoes pick up the friendly loot to keep it safe, and thus I have also changed the coloring around their symbol on the map there. But I actually took the photo on the right too early. My opponent reconsidered the final position of the echoes and actually chose to have them remain around the corner of the building there, because that was still very much close enough to charge into combat thanks to their excellent charge value of 11 strides if necessary, while also not exposing them to my forces unnecessarily. I consider the immediate crisis averted for the time being. The gobblers with their neutral loot token aren't going anywhere, so I want to advance my battle scarred and get the maximum mileage out of them. So I have the unit rush forward, endure a point of stress to capture the loot token that's friendly to me, and to also gather resources. With their total moral value of 3, thanks to the attachment of the Wise Man, they would still be able to activate a second time during this round even without reducing their stress. So I was thinking that they are now doing what I'm paying for them to do. They are playing the scenario, they are threatening the enemy, and they are looking to make a problem out of themselves. On the third turn, Tanan's game plan also starts to kick in to the next gear. He advances his Rumpy Ride closer to his friendly loot token, and he uses its command skill Breath of Makaera to recover a gobbler to my unit, which effectively invalidates the damage that the Dark Master has done so far. This makes Tanan very happy, and he's joking about how he's saddened by the loss of the gobbler, and oh, here it comes back again. Seeing the list that Tanan brought, I knew this was going to be an issue, but I was thinking that okay, I just have to keep a cool head, and I have to burn through the command tokens first, and there's nothing I can do to stop him from returning his lost units to the battlefield. I can just try and make it as expensive as possible by forcing him to commit command token after command token for the job, and eventually he would hopefully run out of tokens so that I could actually inflict some meaningful damage. Next I have my battle scarred reactivate and charge into the gobblers. I'm not too worried about the echoes countercharging me. If this all has to end up in a huge brawl in the middle of the battlefield, I think I'm going to be favored in that situation, so I'm not too worried. I have plenty of reinforcements that I can feed to that combat if that becomes necessary. As my unit of battle scarred is about to receive its third point of stress for the round for activating yet again at the end of its activation, I choose to push them for additional performance. This adds another point of stress to the unit, but grants me a third red dice for my attack attempt. And this means that I'm able to, despite the excellent defensive dice and the tiny ability of the gobblers, to cause yet another casualty on them, and I'm also able to leverage the Wise Man provided double special switch ability in order to impose the vulnerable state upon the unit, making them more susceptible to my future attacks. Unfortunately, this means that my battle scarred are now at 4 stress and they have only morale 3, which means that I have to make a willpower check to see if they break and flee from the field of battle. But thanks to the Wise Man, my unit is rolling 2 orange dice and a yellow dice for my willpower, and if I somehow fail, I get to re-roll the result, meaning that the battle scarred are almost unbreakable in effect, and I passed the test with flying colors, so no problems there. Tanan is also keeping a cool head and keeping to his game plan. He yet again activates the Rumpy Ride, advancing it to capture his second friendly loot marker, and then again invalidates the damage I have done on the Gobbler so far by returning yet another one of the annoying red caps back to the field of battle. I have luckily have enough experience playing the red caps beforehand that I knew this was going to happen, so I didn't get hot under the collar, so to speak, but I was genuinely happy to see how much joy my opponent got out of returning these tough to kill models back into play over and over again, and I feel that it's a really cool mechanic to have in the game. Thinking that there was nothing I could do to resolve the situation in the middle of the battlefield at this time, my only real option now with the battle scarred full of stress would have been to attack with the Dark Master and probably not inflict all that much damage. I chose instead to try and pressure the left flank by having my Wrathmane's Hunter unit advance forward at full speed. While this did allow them to gather further resources, their speed meant that they overshot the loot marker quite considerably and were unable to pick it as they went. But I thought that this was okay. I was looking to use the unit in a very aggressive way, and I also thought that I don't want them to carry a loot marker to a dangerous area should my opponent attack, destroy or break the unit. And I already had my pause on one of the markers, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to capture more than my opponent during this round anyway, so I didn't consider picking up the loot counter to be a high priority. Later on, Tanan told me that at this point he was starting to feel the pressure of me being way ahead in the resource collection department, and partially to redeem this problem and also to safeguard his important rumpy ride from the threatening orc hunters, he chooses to bring in the marked marksmen via scout and deploy them to the edge of the battlefield, from which they would then move sideways in order to protect the rumpy ride and also to collect resources. I have to admit that at this point I forget to check whether the marksmen enter the battlefield from such a position that I would have been able to trigger the sharp perception provided free movement on my orc hunters, but had that been the case, my opponent could have just adjusted the position of the marksman a few strides back so that he could have denied me this ability. He'd already seen my Dark Master, so he knew that I had access to this ability, and since you are allowed to pre-measure everything in Warcrow, he would have been able to pre-measure a spot from which it was safe for the marked marksman to enter the battlefield without triggering the free movement on my hunters. For the last activation of the first round, I conclude that there is nothing major important that I can achieve from scenario play point of view. So I think that my priority is to further consolidate my lead on the resource meter, and I think that I can potentially catch or kill rather two birds with one stone by having my Wrathmane's hunters charge the marked marksman and thus inflict some attrition on them. And since I was able to win the combat by dealing more damage to them than they did to me, I was then given the chance to push them back. And since the defending unit the losing unit can only stop itself from being pushed back if they can endure a stress token to do so, the full of stress marked marksmen would be unable to stop me from pushing them away, which would in turn free my Wrathmane's hunters to also collect resources after they had completed their attack. This did mean, however, that when they would obtain the stress token that came to them from activating for a second time during this round, they would actually go into excess stress, and I had to roll my double orange willpower to see if they would break and flee. I was willing to accept this risk because I knew that I would be able to use my evoker's Delegate of the Ancestors ability to return them into battle should that become necessary later on, or the unit might just rally on its own. But everything went well. The Wrathmane kept a strong discipline over his unit, and they passed their test, shedding the excess stress and ending the round in a victorious fashion. At the end of the round, all units that have activated get to reduce their stress level by 1, and the units that did not activate would be able to reduce their stress level by 2. Then the units that did not actually activate get to perform a no one gets left behind move, which allows them to perform either the rest action or to move a single short skills or short activations worth of movement in the direction they choose. As you can see from the representation here, the book bowls seek to come to the support of the other Scions units on my left flank, while the sightless wanders towards the echoes. The rest of my characters and my reserve unit of orc hunters make for the middle of the table in order to keep the options open when it comes to where they'll be advancing to going forward. At the end of the round, we also score the scenario part of this adventure for the first time. Um, and this means that because Tanan is holding at least one loot token and he's controlling more loot tokens than me, he gets 2 military points, but because I'm controlling at least one myself too, I get a single military point. So we end the round with a 2-1 advantage for the Scions of Yaldabaoth, but this means that since now I'm quote unquote losing the battle, the initiative shifts into my hands and I get to pick who starts activating on the next round. At this point, it comes to us, for both of us, into sharp focus how the fact that the arcane points in this feat are only scored at the end of the game means that the fact that I'm ahead on resources still allows me to keep the initiative going forward because Tanan has, through the loot token, securing gained more military points, even though the difference between us in total victory points is very minimal at this stage. The second round of the game begins with the Gobblers and the Book Bowls yet again activating their Anxious Mob passive skill. We misplay this one a bit because we misremember both that the Anxious Mob is a place effect, which is a quote unquote which would effectively be quote unquote a teleport into position, and place effects allow units to engage enemy units in melee if they so choose. But in fact, it's a Anxious Mob is a displace effect, which means a straight line of movement along the ground, and it does not allow one to engage enemy units in melee. So there's that, but hey, you live and you learn. So Tanan uses the place for Gobblers to try and escape melee from melee with my units, and the Book Bowls seek to displace to tie down the Wrathmane's hunters in melee. I think at this point that if I'm ever going to have a chance of wiping out the Gobblers and taking the neutral loot token from them, I need to keep up the pressure, hit them again, so as to put them full of stress once more and hopefully inflict some meaningful casualties on them. Thanks to the fact that I get to charge again, which allows me to re-roll my attack roll once if I so choose, and due to the fact that the unit is suffering from the vulnerable state, and the battle scarred have the relentless special ability which allows them to inflict additional damage against enemy units suffering from any negative states. I'm actually able to this time inflict some rather heavy casualties against the Gobblers, hopefully forcing Tanan's hand going forward. Tanan correctly concludes that the way my battle scarred had to fan out in order to attack the Gobblers would actually stop my Dark Master from also charging the unit, so he's free to focus on the left flank for the time being. He decides that the best way forward is to try and limit the options of my Orc Hunters led by the Wrathmane, so he chooses to have the Marked Marksman charge them. Unfortunately, the attack bounces off, so the Orc Hunters neither suffer any casualties nor do they gain any additional stress, but they are now engaged so that they cannot perform the rest action going forward. At this point, I also realized that the Dark Master can't engage the Gobblers, even though I really want to find a way to do so. So instead I simply choose to reposition the assassin in a way that allows him to threaten both the Rumpy Ride and the Gobblers should I choose to re-engage them going forward. Tanan correctly calculates that if and when he advances the Rumpy Ride, or rather retreats the Rumpy Ride to a position where it's impossible for the Dark Master to charge between the marked marksman and the rugged terrain to reach the red cap character, he will be effectively safe from the advances of the Orc Assassin for the time being. So the Rumpy Ride retreats and casts the spell Stir the Inner Fire, which helps the Red Caps inflict more damage so long as the spell lasts. When rolling for additional duration for the spell, Tanan has to include some black dice to oppose his own spellcasting roll, and with the roll of a hollow block symbol, his spellcaster has to endure a point of tinge. Tinge is a dark, magical, corrupting substance that spellcasters who tap too deeply into the magical forces may end up having affect their bodies, and if enough tinge accumulates, then it's going to be lights out for the spellcaster, and in a most extreme case, some of the models and units near them. At this point I conclude that the situation in the middle of the battlefield is well and truly under control, and I still have the option of sending, for example, the Prime Warrior there if the Echoes want to get involved and I feel that I need additional combat power. So instead I choose to send Lotta's Hunters to support the left flank, which is now coming under some intense pressure from the Scions of Yaldabaoth forces. I'm also able to use the 4+ member unit to gather yet more resources, further solidating my position as the king of resource gathering in this game. Tanan is taking note that he's unable to activate the Gobblers yet again due to the fact that I'm pressuring them full of stress and engaging them at every opportunity, and he also concludes that sending in the Echoes is not going to solve the situation, so instead he chooses to continue pressuring my left flank and hoping to achieve a breakthrough there. Enhanced by Stir the Inner Fire, the Buck Bowls, with the help of the Sightless, attack my Orc Hunters unit, inflict casualties, and push them back. But the Hunters are still able to stay on the field and offer resistance going forward. The continued attacks by the Red Caps validate my decision to send my second unit of Orc Hunters in support, and now it's Lotta's fresh unit's turn to get in there. She cracks her whip, activates her command skill Move Your Asses, and charges her unit into the Buck Bowls, causing 2 casualties, which is quite a significant amount of damage against such a sturdy unit. Again, a good defense roll and the tiny passive skill make attacking them rather difficult, but Lotta is capable of getting the most out of her unit, so I'm pretty happy what I have been able to achieve here. I feel slowly that I'm achieving a point where I have inflicted so many casualties on Tanan's forces, and he has had to spend so many command tokens that he cannot maintain this tempo of engagement forever. Next, Tanan seeks to use the marked marksman and the attached needle to achieve as many things as possible during a single activation. He advances the unit forward, restores yet another model back to the field, this time through the Needle's Assemble Bodies command skill, which not only returns a book bowl back to the unit, but also causes the frightened state upon Lotta's hunters, forcing her unit to re-roll the next successful willpower test that they make. Then the marked marksmen proceed to rain bolts from the crossbows against the orcish forces, but they fail to do any damage. And rather crucially, when they roll for their gathering of resources, they also fail this roll despite having a four-member unit and thus the rainbow of offensive dice. So this extremely unlucky roll means that Tanan is firmly behind when it comes to the resource gathering, that is the feat completion of this adventure. For my last activation of the second round, I feel that the situation on the left flank is more or less under control. I'm also at this point content to sacrificing that entire flank if it becomes necessary, because I trust that the Varang Tattooist can evacuate my last loot counter if that becomes necessary, and the Orc Hunters are, I'm sorry to say, and sound so callous, expendable if that becomes necessary. So instead I choose to pile on the pressure by charging the Dark Master into the remaining gobblers. When a unit is engaged by several enemy units at the same time, they have to shed a dice or an automatic symbol from their attack/defense roll for each enemy unit beyond the first that they are engaged by. But despite this, the Dark Master can't inflict meaningful enough casualties due to the high defenses and the tiny keyword of the gobblers. At this point, Tanan decides to take a calculated risk and charge the Rumpy Ride into close combat against the Hunters, hoping to leverage the fact that the Hunters are now engaged by more than one unit in melee. At this point, I think Tanan only has a single command point left, so he figures that even if the Orc Hunters, with their ability to exchange their block symbols for successes, somehow manage to take out the Rumpy Ride, it's a casualty that Tanan can live with, since the last command token can still be spent by the Needle later on during the battle. This calculated risk pays off in a big way, as not only are the Lotta's unit unable to take out the Rumpy Ride despite causing 3 wounds on it, the Rumpy Ride proceeds to wipe out all the rest of the Orc Hunters, and suffering from the frightened state, Lotta's nerve gives up, she breaks and flees from the bloodthirsty Redcaps. The situation on the scoring board looks more or less the same again at the end of the second round. The Scions again outscore me on scenario 2-1, but at the same time I have a commanding lead when it comes to the resources gathered, and I feel that I have a good chance of securing the neutral loot token during the last round. Thanks to ending the turn in base-to-base contact with the book bowls, who in turn have the sightless attached to the unit, the Rumpy Ride is able to access the passive skill Lava Extract from the chimney to heal a wound automatically, so that's pretty cool. I yet again use my no one gets left behind moves to push my Orc characters towards the center of the field, while the Tattooist starts moving towards my friendly loot counter in expectation that she will need to pick it up during the last round of the game. Tanan has the option of advancing with the echoes and the sightless on the right flank, but he sees no need for that since the echoes are firmly in a position from which they can already countercharge either of my units should they choose to do so, and they want to keep their loot tokens safe. At the beginning of the round 3, the Pokeballs displays forward in order to keep up the pressure on the remaining orcs on the flank, while the Gobblers continue their attempted retreat away from the battle scarred. But this all is for naught, as I am finally able to land the decisive killing blow on the unit by activating my battle scarred and charging them yet again. And when I'm able to destroy an enemy unit entirely, that grants the unit doing the destroying a free movement action, and I use this movement in order to quote-unquote bubble wrap the now dropped neutral loot token with my battle scarred. They are unable to pick up a second token due to the fact that they are already carrying one, but lo and behold, the Dark Master is right next to them, ready and able to pick up the token later on if and when necessary. Later on, Tanan tells me that at this point he was considering using his last command point to have the Rampy Ride return the destroyed Gobbler unit back to the field, but he considers to be a moot point since I have been able to secure the loot token by bubble wrapping it in veteran orc warriors. Instead, he chooses to focus on his efforts on the left flank, and he attacks my orc hunters yet again with the book balls, putting them full of stress and effectively stopping them from activating going forward. As I see no imminent danger for my Dark Master's ability to capture the neutral loot token later on, I instead choose to use my next activation on my Tattooist, and she picks up the loot token still left outside my deployment zone and retreats back to the safety of my deployment zone, also hedging her bets by moving a bit closer to the forest. There's nothing that can attack her from where she is standing, where she's standing right now, and should Tanan push any units dangerously close to her, she can just run and hide in the forest and be safe there, so I'm feeling pretty good about her position at the moment. Tanan tries to throw everything he has left at my left flank, and while the book balls manage to destroy the last of my hunters, my Wrathmane stands tall before them and refuses to break even though he's suffering from the frightened state. Lotta now also gets a chance to rally, and despite still suffering from the frightened state, she actually succeeds in her willpower roll twice in a row, removing the frightened state and allowing her to return to the fray. Now that I feel that I have both of my own loot tokens in good and safe places, in safe hands, I now take the Dark Master and make him my next highest priority. The assassin becomes a courier as he picks up the neutral loot token and then darts for the relative safety of the nearby ruins, where I spend a stress token or accumulate a stress token on him in order to try and gather resources. It's unlikely that I succeed on a single yellow dice, but at the same time I have 2 morale on the unit and I'm not planning to activate them anytime again if I can help it, so I might as well try. And the luck is again on my side when it comes to gathering resources, and I succeed yet again. I'm able to thus push Tanan's counter back away from mine, meaning that it'll be easier for me to get more of a victory point lead when it comes to scoring the end of this mission. At this stage of the game, Tanan later on says that he knew that there was nothing he could do to try and get the loot tokens away from me, so he instead is going to focus on trying to extract as many resources as possible during the rest of the game. The best unit for such a action at the moment is going to be the marked marksmen, so they use their crossbows to finally gun down Lotta, and then they proceed to obtain some additional resources. I failed to take a picture of this one in the heat of the moment, but I'm simply going to use my battle scar to form a wall of orc between them and the Dark Master in order to stop the echoes from getting any ideas of trying to go after my assassin who's holding the neutral loot token at this point. I don't feel like engaging the echoes since there is no chance of me destroying them at this point of the game, nor would destroying them actually get me anywhere since there is no way I'm going to be able to stop Tanan from holding at least one loot token, and there's always the chance that something goes terribly wrong and I drop my loot token, so better just be safe than sorry, I think. The marked marksmen continue trying to gather resources, and while they succeed at this endeavor, they get really unlucky with their shots and they fail to take out my evoker. For my last activation of the game, I don't feel that there is very much anything productive that I can do, but now that the evoker is there, I choose to endure a point of tinge by accessing the hallucinogenic mushrooms in order to throw a rock at the marked marksman. I'll actually fail to do any damage, but I manage yet again, luckily, to recover some resources with a single yellow dice. The closing activation of the game belongs to Tanan, and he advances his echoes forward to a position from which it's legal to try and gather resources, but as has been the trend for today, they fail their role, and this ends the game. At the end of the match, I was able to finish with the full amount of resources 10, and I was also able to push back Tanan's marker several times over, which actually meant that he was not able to secure the 4 points required for any feat completion arcane point rewards. At the end of the game, thanks to having more loot tokens under my control during the last round of the game, I end up with 4 military points from completing the scenario and 4 arcane points from getting the maximum points possible out of the feat. While Tanan gets more military points than me, 5, he actually doesn't get any arcane points, so when it comes to the victory points themselves, I win the game 8-5. But in a Warcrow tournament format, you need to also check whether the victorious player got both more military points and more arcane points than their opponent for full victory, and I was obviously unable to achieve that due to the excellent scenario play of my opponent, which means that I achieve a partial triumph while the Scions forces have to contend with a tactical retreat. Had this game been a part of a Warcrow tournament, I would have walked away from this one with 3 tournament points, and Tanan would have been able to get a single tournament point for his troubles. Okay, time to close this one out with some final thoughts from both players. Here are some of the things that Tanan wanted to point out after the game. Firstly, he expressed that he feels that the tournament rules Warcrow feels really different from the previous games that we have had, and he really thought that it was a rather enjoyable and challenging an experience. Tanan was thinking that in this particular scenario plus feed combination, it would have been more worthwhile to focus more on gathering resources, so including more large units would have helped that. And focusing less on the loot tokens might have been a good idea. He also pointed out that the resource mining mechanic present in this feat can be quite swingy, since you can at most roll anything between 0 and 4 on your dice rolls, and if the game goes as it did today, that one side is rolling quite well on their resource extraction rolls and the other one is rolling really unluckily, unless the scenario element is able to offer enough points to offset this discrepancy in luck. It's really tough to come back from a situation like this. Tanan also figured that rushing the middle objective at the beginning of the game might not have been the best idea, since the way the arcane points are scored only at the end of the game and the military points are scored throughout, the player who gets the most military points from the first two rounds effectively surrenders the initiative to their opponent for the second and third rounds of the game. We also talked about how it would actually have been a better move to have the Rumpy Ride join the Gobblers instead of the Overseer. Tanan was thinking that it might be a tad risky to commit the Rumpy Ride to the middle objective from the get-go, but the wizard would have made the Gobblers into a Moral 3 unit, which would have meant that had he not collected resources on his first activation, he would have been able to retreat them to safety even if I had chosen to engage them with the Dark Master, due to the fact that Tiny allows a unit to break contact without suffering any adverse effects, and the unit would have had access to another activation even despite taking stress from my attack. But obviously, with the limited amount of experience we have at this point, it's really hard to assess how such a maneuver would have affected the remainder of the game, especially since the entire game would have gone on a different trajectory because of this choice. For my final thoughts, I would like to express how really enthusiastic I am about the new tournament rules for Warcrow. They feel really intriguing. There is a lot of things to do. There was a lot of brain power consumed during this game, and the fact that each adventure is made out by two different components means that there are so many different combinations out there, and I am really excited to try and test out the different scenarios and different feats in different combinations, and what types of adventures they end up giving us. This game further strengthened my preference for the orc units over the Varank ones, since I tend to love the combat power and redundancy that they seem to offer in better quantities than with the Varank units. At the same time, I did feel that my force as a whole was a bit clunky to maneuver, and I would have appreciated a fast maneuver element out there. So maybe a unit of marauders that I have really, Tundra marauders that I have really loved using would be a good addition to a list such as this also. The Evoker and the Prime Warrior turned out to be pretty much letdowns. I was unable to use them to any major effect, so I might consider swapping them out going forward. But then again, I have had games where their interventions have been extremely influential in the end result, so it's really hard to say one way or the other whether they are on average a good addition to this type of list or not. I also took note that I was actually sitting on most of my command points at the end of the game, which tells me that I failed to utilize them correctly. I only needed to save maybe one or two at max for the use of the Evoker and the Prime Warrior for the last round of the game. And since there was no additional chances where Lotta really could have used Move Your Asses, I could have been using the Fix Die ability of the Wise Main in order to inflict more damage throughout the battle, or then I could have used the Wrathmane's Wrath Roar to debuff the enemy units on the left flank. But I have to say that I was so cognitively overworked with all the decision points, all the scoring elements, and also trying to photograph the game that I simply didn't have the bandwidth to make better use of my command tokens. So there is something that I need to learn going forward, and I also need to reconsider how I built my list's command skill abilities. All in all, I had so much fun playing this game, and I really can't wait for the next one. Hope you have enjoyed this first battle report in my series The Sagas of the Heroes, and hope to hear your comments on how you like this one. Good luck for all your future battles, fellow travelers. Have a good one.